My name is Elena Marsh. I was 27 when I finally understood what my sister thought of me. It happened on a Tuesday, which is the kind of detail you remember only after everything falls apart. The ordinariness of it, the fact that the sky wasn't dark and there was no thunder, just the low hum of the refrigerator and my mother's kitchen radio playing something forgettable. I had just come from a 12-hour shift at the hospital lab, the kind of day that leaves your hands smelling like antiseptic no matter how many times you wash them. All I wanted was my car keys hanging on the little brass hook by the door where they always hung, where they had hung since I was 16. They weren't there. Looking for these? Claire said. She was leaning against the counter, twirling my keys around one finger, and she had that smile. The one she'd worn since we were children. The one that meant she already knew she'd won something before I understood we were playing. Claire, I have an early shift tomorrow. I need my car. Do you? She tilted her head. Because Mom's paying for gas this month, and Mom said the car is shared. And I have somewhere to be tonight that matters more than your little blood samples. I stood there in my scrubs, too tired to argue, and something in me, something that had been quiet for years, went very still. Claire, please. She walked past me, keys jingling, close enough that I caught her perfume, the expensive kind I'd given her for her birthday 2 years ago. At the door she turned back, and that's when she said it, light as a joke, the words she probably forgot within the hour and I would not forget for the rest of my life. You deserve nothing, Elena. You never have. The door closed. I heard the engine, my engine, pull out of the driveway and fade into the evening traffic. I didn't cry. That surprised me most of all. I stood in the kitchen a long time, listening to the radio play a song about a river, and I thought about every hook that Smile had ever caught me on, going back so many years I'd lost count of the scars. I thought about the science fair project she borrowed in 8th grade and presented as her own. The boyfriend she took in college, not because she wanted him but because I did. The promotion she implied to our parents she deserved more than me, though she'd never once asked what my job even involved. I thought about the word nothing, and how strange it was that a person could stand in a doorway and hand you an entire verdict on your worth like it was a fact of nature. I didn't sleep well that night. I sat by the window with a cup of tea gone cold, watching the driveway, waiting for headlights that didn't come until almost 2 in the morning. When they did, Claire stumbled in laughing at something on her phone, dropped my keys on the counter like a receipt from a store, and went to bed without a glance in my direction. I picked the keys up. They were still warm from her hand. That was the moment I stopped being someone who absorbed things quietly. Not with rage. With clarity. I realized, holding that small brass weight, that I had spent my whole life mistaking her cruelty for personality, her selfishness for charm, because everyone else in the family did too. I made a decision that night, sitting alone in the dark kitchen. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to fight her the way she fought, with mockery, with taking. I was going to do something slower and far more permanent. I was going to let the truth catch up to her. I work in a hospital laboratory, but before that, in the years right after college, I worked 2 years in our family's small accounting office, the one our father built from nothing, the one Claire now ran the front of, greeting clients with that same practiced warmth she'd used on me my whole life. I still had the old login. Nobody had ever thought to remove it because nobody had ever thought I'd need it because nobody had ever thought I mattered enough to check. I want to be honest about what happened next because this is not a story about hacking or theft or anything dramatic. It's smaller than that and sadder. I simply remembered where the paper trail lived. 2 years ago, before I left for the hospital, I had noticed something in the client ledgers that never sat right with me. Invoices marked consulting, with no consulting attached, small transfers into an account with Claire's initials on the memo line. I hadn't known, then, what to do with what I'd seen. I was 25, new to caring about anything beyond my own survival, and I told myself it wasn't my business. Now I opened the old files again, at 3 in the morning, my sister asleep down the hall in the room our mother still called the good room because she'd always favored Claire's comfort over mine. The pattern was clearer than I remembered. Money moving in small enough amounts that no single transfer looked wrong, but over 2 years, they added up to something that would matter very much to our father, who trusted his daughter with his life's work the way he'd never quite managed to trust me with anything. I didn't print anything. I didn't confront her. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark a long time, my heart doing something slow and heavy, because here was the strange thing. Even now, holding proof that could unmake her comfortable little kingdom, I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted her to stop smiling like that, like taking was her right, and I was furniture. I thought about my mother's voice from 100 childhood dinners. Claire needs more support. Elena, you're the strong one, you don't need as much. And I understood, finally, that being called strong had only ever meant being asked to need less so someone else could take more. I fell asleep at the kitchen table and woke to Claire humming in the shower, getting ready for a day she had no idea was about to look different than the one before it. I didn't go to my father immediately. I want that understood because this isn't a story about ambush. It's about earning the right to be believed. I spent the next week watching, not with anger but with the same patience I use reading lab results, looking for the pattern under the noise. I found 3 more transfers. I found a text message left open on the shared family tablet, careless the way Claire was always careless with things she assumed no one else would ever see. Don't worry, Dad doesn't check that account. He trusts me, lol. LOL. As if trust were a joke you could spend. On Thursday evening I asked her, gently, no accusation in my voice, whether she remembered a client named Whitfield. It was a small thing. A test. I watched her face for half a second of hesitation before the smile slid back into place. Vaguely. Why? No reason. I was just going through some old files. For fun. She laughed at that, for fun, as if the idea of me finding anything interesting in numbers was itself the joke, and went back to her phone. But I saw it. The half-second. The flicker before the performance resumed. That night I called our father. Not to accuse her. To ask him, carefully, whether he'd reviewed the Whitfield account recently, whether the consulting fees made sense to him. I kept my voice level. I didn't want revenge to sound like revenge. I wanted it to sound like concern, because it was concern, buried under years of things I'd swallowed rather than said. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Why are you asking me this, Elena? Because I think somebody should look before it becomes a bigger problem than it needs to be. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. There was only one person besides him with access to those accounts, and it wasn't me. I hung up feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but grief. Grief for the sister I might have had, if either of us had ever been taught that love wasn't a competition for our parents' limited attention. My father called an informal family meeting that Saturday, the kind our family used to have when I was young, and someone needed to be reminded whose turn it was to do the dishes. Except this time the stakes were different, and everyone in the room could feel it. Claire arrived late, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, even though it was evening, radiating the casual confidence of a woman who had never once been asked to answer for anything. "What's this about?" she asked, dropping onto the couch, glancing at her phone. My father set a folder on the coffee table. Not thrown. Set down, gently, the way you set down something heavy you've been carrying a long time. "The Whitfield account," he said. "And 3 others. I watched her face rearrange itself in real time. Confusion first, genuine, and then something colder sliding underneath it as she understood this wasn't a misunderstanding she could charm her way out of. "Where did you get this?" she asked, and her eyes found mine before her mouth finished the sentence, because some part of her already knew. "I asked Dad to look," I said. "That's all I did." "You went through my accounts." "They were never your accounts, Claire. They were the business's. Dad's." She stood up. For a moment I thought she might do what she'd always done, turn the room against me with a single well-aimed sentence, the way she had for 20 years, casting herself as wounded and me as cruel. She opened her mouth to do exactly that. But our father spoke first, quietly, and his quiet was worse than shouting. "I want to hear you explain the numbers, Claire. Not explain your sister." And there it was, the first time in either of our lives that someone in this family had refused to let her deflect onto me. I felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been sealed shut since I was small enough to believe that being unseen was simply what I deserved. Claire didn't explain the numbers. She left the room instead, and none of us followed her. The days that followed were not cinematic. There was no scene of Claire on her knees, no dramatic confession scored by swelling music. Real reckonings are quieter and slower than that. Made of phone calls to a lawyer, of my father sitting very still at the kitchen table with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, of my mother finally asking me what I needed instead of what Claire needed. Claire called me at 11 that night, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "You could have just talked to me," she said. "I tried, for 20 years, I said. You were never listening. You were only ever performing being listened to." Silence on the line. Then, "Are you going to let them take everything from me?" I thought about the keys jingling around her finger. "You deserve nothing." I thought about how easy it would be, right now, to hand that sentence back to her, word for word, and watch it land the way it had landed on me. I didn't. "I'm not taking anything from you, Claire. I just stopped protecting you from what you'd already done." She cried then, really cried, not the practiced tears she'd used to get her way with our parents since childhood, but something raw, something that sounded like a person meeting themselves for the first time without an audience to perform for. "I don't know how to be anything except the favorite," she said. "I don't know who I am if I'm not that." It was, I think, the most honest sentence she had ever said to me. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I wasn't ready to promise that, and I've never believed in lying to sound kind. But I stayed on the phone with her a long time, past midnight, past the hour when the sky over the driveway began to lighten at its edges, gray easing into gold the way it does every morning whether or not anyone deserves to see it. By the time the sun actually rose, she wasn't demanding anything from me anymore. She was asking, for the first time I could remember, what she should do next. Really asking, the way you ask someone you respect rather than someone you assume will simply hand you what you want. 3 months later, the brass hook by the kitchen door still holds one set of car keys, mine. Claire moved into her own apartment, paid for with her own smaller, harder-earned paycheck from a job that has nothing to do with our father's business anymore. The restitution is still being worked out between them, slowly, the way these things have to be worked out when the people involved actually intend to remain a family afterward. We don't talk every day. Some wounds don't close just because the truth finally arrived. But she called last week, tentative, to ask whether I wanted to get coffee, and I said yes, and neither of us mentioned the keys, though I think we both thought about them the entire time. I didn't destroy my sister. I want to be clear about that, because there was a version of the story where the folder on the coffee table could have been so much heavier, where I could have let her lose everything instead of only what she'd taken. I chose the smaller reckoning. Not because I'd forgiven her yet, I hadn't, not fully, maybe not ever completely, but because I understood, sitting in that kitchen the night she took my keys, that the point was never to make her feel as small as she'd made me feel. The point was to stop letting her decide what I deserved. My mother found me in the kitchen a few weeks after everything settled, drying a mug I'd already dried twice, the way you do when your hands need something to occupy them while your mind works through something larger. "I should have seen it sooner," she said. "The way we let her take from you." I told myself it was just how sisters are. "It's okay, Mom." "It isn't. But thank you for not burning the house down to prove it." I laughed, surprising myself, because it was the first time laughter had come easily since the night the keys jingled out the door without me. My mother hugged me then, longer than she usually did, and I understood that this too was a kind of restitution, smaller than money, harder to calculate, but real. I still think, sometimes, about that half-second flicker on Claire's face when I asked about the Whitfield account. I think about how much of our lives are built on the assumption that no one is watching closely enough to notice the pattern under the noise. I was watching. I had always been watching. I had simply never before believed my own observations were worth trusting over someone else's smile. I drive to work most mornings now with the windows down, even in the cold, because there's something about the air moving through the car that reminds me it's mine, has always been mine, the payments, the maintenance, the worn driver's seat shaped exactly to the way I sit. Claire texted me a picture last night of her new apartment, small and a little bare, a single lamp glowing in the corner of an empty living room. "It's not much," she wrote, "but it's mine." I understood, reading it, that we were finally speaking the same language, the one about what belongs to a person because they built it, not because someone handed it to them out of habit or guilt or fear of conflict. I didn't answer right away. I sat for a while with the phone in my hand, remembering a kitchen, a brass hook, a set of keys spinning on a finger like a small, careless crown. "You deserve nothing," she'd said once in a doorway, certain of her own verdict. She was wrong. Not because I ever needed her to admit it, but because somewhere in that long, quiet, sunrise-colored night, I had finally admitted it to myself. I wrote back 3 words, nothing more. It's a start. Then I set the phone down, picked up my keys from the hook where they've always belonged, and drove into a morning that, for the first time in a long time, felt entirely my own. Elena's story isn't really about car keys or ledgers, or even about Claire. It's about the moment we stop mistaking someone else's cruelty for our own worthlessness and start trusting what we've quietly known all along. Real justice doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like finally being believed. If this story hit home, if you've ever been the strong one who was expected to need less so someone else could take more, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had your own sunrise moment where the truth finally caught up? Drop a comment if you'd have done exactly what Elena did. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, powerful, no shouting, just truth, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because next week's story might be the one that feels like it was written about your family.